Well, good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here this morning. My name is Claire, and I am the Archives Manager at Mayhair Archive Collective. Today, we have a real treat. We have a wonderful interview with Sheila Krynski that we're going to be showing, and she talks about her coming to BABA, her journey into the world of printing, and her work with Andy Linsky to start the Sherier Press, which is incredibly exciting to me because here at MAC, we aren't just creating an archive to house treasures, we're also building a library with a bunch of resources, books, audio tapes, anything you could think of that might be in a library that could be interesting to a spiritual seeker, a researcher, anyone now and 100 years from now. And many of the resources that we have in the library come from Sherier Press. So I want to thank Sheila for all her hard work over the years at the press and for allowing us to show this interview. I hope everyone is excited, as excited as I am. So if everyone is ready, we can get this started.
I'm just going to start out telling how I heard about BABA, because in my view, that is connected from the very beginning with printing and then the foundation, publication and foundation. So I feel it's connected. So I just wanted to share that. And even a little bit before BABA, which is like in 1965, when I lived in Norway for a year, and I painted and painted and painted. And that's what I did. And it was the way that I would search for God. And I did that for a year, and I came back and I didn't know what to do. So I got a job at the Department of Welfare in New York and finally found a place to live, and I started painting again at night. I wasn't very good at the Department of Welfare, and I really wanted to get out of there. New York City had a shortage of teachers, and then anybody with a degree in anything could become a teacher. You just had to take a summer school course. So I left my job at the Department of Welfare, and I signed up for the course. Thousands and thousands of people signed up for it. We had to go up to City College where the classes were. And after at the end of the classes, they arbitrarily picked a very small group of people to become what they called corrective reading teachers and corrective math teachers in parochial schools. It was a Board of Education federal program because the parochial schools were in the ghetto areas. Corrective reading teacher means the old remedial reading. And so I had to teach in 2 Catholic schools, Our Lady of Pompeii and Holy Cross. And I got all of the poor readers would come to my room. And my supplies didn't arrive. So I had nothing to teach with. And during that time, I also met Adele Wolkin, who was also in the same program. And we got together and decided to chip in and get what's called a Diddle machine. It was supposed to be one of our supplies, but it didn't come. It's like a little mimeographic machine, but it makes like purple print. And I figured I could make lessons for my class on that. And at the time I was living in a painting studio in an area called Soho, which at the time was just loft buildings for artists, and way downtown Manhattan. And the minute I put the Ditto machine in my studio, where I lived, I fell in love with it. And I felt it was what I was looking for my whole life. And I started learning how to use it. And what I discovered was that you could print in many colors, because the way it worked was that there was a master, which was just a sheet of paper. Behind it was a carbon. And it's as if you put the carbon paper in backwards. If you would type, the image would come backwards reading on the back of that master. And then you put the master on a drum of the ditto machine, and then it would become frontwards reading again. But the thing is that you could change the color of the carbons. They were yellow carbons and green and blue and black. So I started doing multicolor printing and immediately started doing printing about Baba. I never used it for my class at all. And there was a couple who lived in New York called Fred and Ella Winterfeld. They eventually moved to Myrtle Beach. They were the head of the New York group. Wonderful old, well, they weren't that old then, but they seemed to be. Anyway, they were the head there. And what they were doing was they would go down to the East Village, which was the kind of the revolutionary area of New York. And they had Baba cards printed called LSD or Love. And it was printed in real old-fashioned lettering. And they would stand outside of Timothy Leary, what they called happenings, and which was some sort of consciousness-raising gathering, but included LSD. And poor Fred and Ella, they looked like Hansel and Gretel. She had a little pillbox hat and a net, and he had a big overcoat and a Homburg hat, and they were kind of shortish, and they would hand out these LSD or Love cards with a message from Baba about the dangers of drugs. And I felt these people need better materials. So I started printing out stuff, which was like love, love, love in different colors and Baba's message on love and triangles and circles and stuff like that, printed it out and would stand out there with them. And I felt like that was I felt like this was on the cutting edge of graphic consciousness. It wasn't, but that's how I felt. And that started the whole thing. And somehow Adele was always in touch with Gohair in India. And she was on some sort of instruction, Adele Walken, she was some sort of instructions on not to write to India. So I used to write her letters. She would dictate her letters, and then I would write her letters to India. So there was this whole correspondence that would happen between her and Gohair, and she was always telling Gohair what was happening because Adele was kind of the hub of all the new people coming. And I forgot to, well, it doesn't, I forgot to say, I'll just put this in, is that the day after I met Adele, she invited me up to her apartment with her. She was married at the time to somebody named George, to have dinner. And I thought we were going to talk about becoming better teachers or something. So I went up there, and I went up there with Erwin Luck. And they were just talking about Baba, which I didn't even understand what they were talking about. And it was very confusing. But then they invited me dinner the next night. Oh, now we'll talk about teaching. And once again, they just kept talking about Baba. And the third night, Erwin and his brother Edward invited me to where they lived, which was they lived with John Bass, who heard about Baba in the 30s, 1931, I think. And they invited me for dinner there. And then afterwards, we all went together in a taxi to the New York meeting, Fred and Ella's New York meetings. And with hindsight, I could see that my first 3 days, right away, I had three meals. And Baba knew how to get to me. Anyway, that was his first intimate touch. Anyway, I went to my first Baba meeting, and there was somebody called Michael Kohano. And I thought he was very intelligent. He was probably a college professor, which he wasn't. And he was reading from a discourse. And my impression of everybody who was there was that they were all very old people, which they're probably over 40. But young people hadn't quite started coming yet. And so I figured I'm not going to understand what Michael Kohana was saying. He was reading from a discourse. So I figured, okay, I'll look at Baba's picture. Fred and Ella had a picture of Baba. It was this big. And on the bottom, in hand letters, it said, "I have not come to teach, but to awaken." And it was in hand letters, like balloon letters, like the H's were like this. And the M's were like this, you know. And my only thought was, and it was in gold, my only thought was that is the stupidest lettering I have ever seen. And at the end of the meetings, they used to sing the Eastern Archie in Gujarati, phonetically written out on a piece of paper. The piece of paper you'd share with your neighbor, and you'd sing this stuff you didn't understand. And I thought that was really weird. But I kept coming back, and the people seemed nice. And there's only one other young person there. His name was Howie Joles, and he was a bus driver. And he received correspondence from Baba. Baba was in seclusion, so you couldn't write to him or anything. And but he got instructions from Baba, and Baba told him to be celibate. And Howie loved women. He was always talking about women, and told him something else too, but I forgot. Oh, and to say his name like 10,000 times a day, some big number. So Fred and Ella got him a little counter so he could keep track of how many times he said Baba's name. And then Howie would get in front of all these old people and tell his woes. He'd say, I'm walking down the block and there are all these beautiful women. What am I going to do? And I loved Howie. I thought he was great. So after my third or fourth meeting, we went out to a luncheonette. The meetings were on 59th Street or 57th Street in Manhattan. And I told him, like, I think everything is very nice, but I don't feel any personal connection. So he said, so don't come back. And somehow between that Monday night and the next Monday night, I knew Baba was God, and I knew I was born to hear of him. And immediately, it was at that point, I think, around that time, that Adele and I bought this ditto machine. And I started, printing was like, all I wanted to do. It was so interesting. And in fact, typical of, I wrote what I call my own story of coming to Baba, and I printed it on this little ditto machine. And it's where I discovered design. It's like partway through the story, Baba's message would start coming in. And first it was on the margins, and my story was still in the middle. And then it became in the middle, and my story was going to the end. And then finally there was a mirror on the last page, and on the page opposite it was, I have come not to teach but to awaken, backwards, so you can read it in the mirror. And I was very excited about it. And I sent it to Adi, because I had so much correspondence with Adi, also because of Adele. So I sent it to him, and I'm sure they were so confused, not knowing what to do with it. All months later, I got a postcard that said, "Note arrival of your manuscript." But what I found out the last couple of years was that one time, what had to be before 69, so it was probably 68, when Baba was in Guru Prasad for the summer months, he asked to see the book. And he had, I think it was Erich, read it to him for a fairly long time. I was stunned, and I felt a little sorry for Baba because it was so amateurish. But anyway, that's what happened. Somewhere around that time, I got a cable from Baba, or Adele got a cable from Baba, and it said, it was, Baba sends this cable from his deepest seclusion, and he's sending his love to Adele, Sheila, and George. And I always thought it should be to Adele, George, and Sheila, but it wasn't that way. When I was working at home, I was still teaching school, but I was working at home in the evenings on the dinner machine. And one night, I had a dream, and it was about something called a multilith, and I didn't know what that was. So I looked it up in the dictionary, and it's the name of a small printing press. Is not, it's a small printing machine, or a little offset machine. And so I looked up in the phone book, and I saw a multilith showroom was on 42nd Street in Manhattan. So I had, by this time, I was calling the small ditto machine the Baba Press, and I had little pieces of cardstock, and I had a rubber stamp made which said Baba Press, and I had the Mastery of Servitude symbol and my address. So I made myself a card, and I went to the multilith sales room, and I said, "Show me a multilith." And the salesman was lovely. I was clearly not a customer. but he went and showed me all the equipment and all the bigger and smaller, the whole 9 yards. And I was very excited about it. And then Fred Ella called me one day and said, oh, I told them, if you want anything printed, please get me, ask me and I'll print it for you. So they called me up and they said they had a letter from somebody named Kitty Davy who lived at Long Lake at Briarcliff. I think so. And it didn't say the center. And I imagine Long Lake to be like full of swans, a beautiful place. And the letter was about raising money to print the universal messages in French for the World's Fair in Montreal. So I went down and picked up the copy of the letter. I came home and I typed it up on a master to print. I ran it off and I took the bus back to Fred and Ella. They lived on 59th Street, and gave it to them. And it was immensely exciting, to like, here it is. And then there was something called the Society for Avatar Meher Baba. And that wasn't like a separate group, but it was just people around Harry Kenmore, who was a chiropractor and he was also blind and spent had an open invitation to go see Baba, and he did go see him a lot. And his helper, who was Anna Rosa Karish, she was like his secretary. And they were in charge. They did a birthday celebration for Baba and a Silence Day celebration, sort of public ones. And so I asked them if I could print for them, and they said, absolutely. So I'd go up there, they'd give me stuff, and I'd print it. And I was just delighted to do that. And then in June of that year, so it must have been 67, Rick Chapman came back from India. And nobody knew who he was, but they did know that Baba said that he should speak publicly about the dangers of drugs. So that's all Adele needed. By this time, I had moved up to Adele's apartment house near the George Washington Bridge. It's called Fort Washington. And so Adele she was like this unstoppable powerhouse. And young people were assisting her. And she would contact radio programs, TV programs, and college campuses to see if Rick could give talks about Baba before he came back. And since we didn't know anything about Rick, we would just make things up, And I remember when he finally came and he'd go to one of the things that were arranged, he'd have to find out what we said about him because we didn't know anything about him. So, it could be anything. But it was quite amazing. Radio, all that opened up. He was on the David Susskind show. He was on he was on the Joe Pine show and on college campuses. And he was on one, and he would carry a Baba film with him, and in case they wanted to show it. And he was great. He was a great public speaker, and because he looked young enough to be hip enough, but he was like actually very smart and a good speaker. So you had to listen to him. What happened was I heard that Fred Winterfeld was home one day, and he turned on the TV, and there's a film of Baba on TV. And for a minute, he thought he had died. But it was Rick on the Joe Pine show, and they were showing a film of Baba. Yeah. And it was a very, very, very exciting time. There was a sense that any day now, Baba was going to break his silence. The world was going to be different. There is no future. It was going to happen any minute, and we just had to keep doing stuff. And I remember when Rick would give talks, I would run off, I called them posters, on this ditto machine you can write. You can also print on legal size paper as well as letter size paper. Legal size is 8.5 by 14. So I would print what I called posters on the 11 by 14, on the 8.5 by 14. And it was always the same. Are you high? Sort of in psychedelic letters. I am the highest of the high. A quote from Baba, and then saying where Rick was talking. And all in different colors. And I remember at this time, I hadn't moved up to Adele's yet, and I was still in my loft. And I remember one evening I called up Rick to get some information about the next talk. And then I'd be running it out. And printing has never been that exciting. There was a sense that the world was going to hear about Baba through this. It's like I'd print like cha-chung, cha-chung, cha-chung. It had a handle that you had to keep moving. And it was very, very exciting. And then at one point, Rick was going to be talking at a church called St. Mark's on the Bowery. And it was like a hotbed of revolution. You know, they had poets and all kinds of people talking there. So we felt it was the most important of all his talks. So Adele and I decided to take a day off from school. And so we could put up posters about it. And so we put them all up in Soho on telephone poles with, a staple gun. And then we figured, hey, poor people aren't the only ones that should hear about Baba. Rich people should hear about Baba too. So we went over to the West Village where they had these nice apartment buildings. And we went into one, we're going to put it up by the mailboxes. And so we passed the doorman, and we're taping up the announcement. And the doorman comes over and he says, do you have the authority to do this? And Adele, in her absolutely most Adele-like way, said, oh, yes, from the highest of the high. He let us do it. But that's what it felt like then. You could do anything. During this time, I was audio taping all of the talks, because there was not only Rick Chapman, there was Alan Cohen, also talked, sometimes with Rick, sometimes separately. And there was Henry Cashowdy would come into town and he would give talks. And whoever gave talks, I would go around and I'd audio record them. And at the time, a portable audio recorder was a Wollensack. It was this heavy thing that you lug around. But I did. It was on reel-to-reel tape. And at one point, I wrote to Adi and said, would Baba like to hear these? And he wrote back and said, yes, send the best of them. Send them on little 3-inch spools so that when we're in Guru Prasad, Baba may or may not listen to them. And let Adele pay for all your expenses. And don't rush and get sick or anything. And they said how I should address it so they didn't have to pay duty on it. And so I started duplicating tapes. And I was duplicating them to people all over the U.S. too, and probably other places too, because people wanted to hear these talks. There was like new people coming. And but for Baba, I put introductions on them because I thought there was a chance that he'd listen to the tape. And I had a roommate by this time, and I had tape recorders all over my part of the apartment. And I would say, this is Rick Chapman speaking at Bard College on such a date. And I'd say it over and over again till it was perfect. And that would go on the beginning of every tape had an introduction. And my roommate got so sick of it. But I had these tapes going all around, and I would ship them out, And in May of in May of 67 or 68, I don't remember, Baba was coming out of seclusion. Nobody knew what that meant, But he also asked that everybody, he said that he made a day of silence. It was the week of May 20th. And there was one of those days, I think it was May 19th, was a day of silence. And it was also the week of my birthday. So I took a vacation from the printing company I was working at, which I didn't tell you, but that's okay. I was working at a printing company. And went down to Myrtle Beach. And while I was down in Myrtle Beach, Gohair wrote to Adele for samples of my printing. So she sent, and have to back up because there are a lot of things that happen about printing and things. And so they were sent to Baba, And to back up just a tiny bit, I was printing pamphlets, which were reproductions from discourses like Love and Travail, the New World Order with a photo of Baba, and then Avatar and something, Love and the Avatar. I don't remember. Two of them, and they were like 15-page little, 16-page little reproductions from the discourses. And they were given out. There was like one of these New Age fairs that Ken Lux was doing in Texas. So he wrote me pamphlets. So I wanted to print them up, and in order to pay for them, I made stationery. And the stationery was the Malabaleshwa picture, which is Baba looking out like this over the mountains. And I printed it in lime green ink, and a fine reproduction has very, very tiny dots. It's called a halftone that you can't see, but I thought the dots were just beautiful. So I made it very coarse. So there was this picture of Baba with very coarse Malabaleshwar, and it was like the whole sheet, and you wrote on the other side. And we sold them like 10 sheets to a package, and we paid for the printing for Ken Lux of the discourses. And there were other things that got printed. I can't remember. And at one point, yes, I found out years and years later that Harry Kenmore complained to Baba about me and said, "You must stop this girl from printing. It's not befitting the avatar." And of course, he was blind, and he saw through the eyes of the person who worked closely with him, who was Anna Rosa. And there was a real disconnect between them and, quote, the young people. So he didn't like anything that came out from that group. But out of the blue, a letter came from Baba. And it was actually from Gohair, but she said, "I've read this to Baba, and this is just what he wanted to say." And Baba said that he was very happy with the tiny Meher Baba press, which is what we called that little press. And in the future, it could bring his message of love to the multitudes. And it would please him if I always worked with the group and not off by myself, which was my druthers. And he said, in the future, work with Kitty and Elizabeth, Rick and Alan Cohen, or John Bass and Fred Nella. And if any one of them approves of the little groups, if they approved what I was printing, it would carry Baba's blessing. And then he said at the end of the letter that he was very happy that I had assisted Rick Chapman in his visit to New York, So Rick probably wrote him what had happened. And but I had no idea why that came. Anyway, so I came down to Myrtle Beach to fast forward the week that Bob was coming out of seclusion. And what had happened was that my very first meeting with Erwin Luck and Eddie, his brother, my very first meeting, I looked around at all the people there, and there was one lady in the back. She had bleach blonde hair, a mink stole, and big glittery rings. And I was thinking, yeah, you don't have to get along with everybody, Well, that lady turned out to be
Here's what I found.
Sorry, it's my watch. That lady turned out to be Nisi Jensen, who I became devoted to. She was an ex-vaudevillian. She was a bird whistler and a comedian with her sister, the Stevens sisters. And she said that they went across America in vaudeville, and vaudeville closed behind them as they went. And she was a very colorful character. And she was very close with Jane Haynes, and she bought Jane's house on 74th Avenue in Myrtle Beach when Jane built her house across from Dilruba on the center. And so she was living there. It was called Happy House. And so when I came down here for my first visit, who should meet me at the bus station? But it was Nisi Jensen, and she was bringing Charles with her because Charles was in high school. She was taking care of them while Jane was away on vacation with Elizabeth. And I was thinking, of all people, that one lady from meetings that I didn't think I could get along with. And I never left her side that week that I was here. It was wonderful. And at one point, I kept running into Kitty. You know, I'd be walking around and our paths would cross, and she said, well, it looks like we're supposed to get together. So we went, she invited me for lunch on the back porch of Del Ruba, and somebody named Ada Schifrin from Florida was there. And Kitty had a turtle. What was her turtle's name? Freddie, was it? Jimmy. And Jimmy went out in the sort of compound outside the back porch, and Ada's job was to make sure that Jimmy didn't get lost in the woods. So she was outside watching Jimmy, and I was on the porch with Kitty eating lunch. I had no idea who she was or anything, but I knew she was very important. And at one point, I had met Marshall before this, who I adored. And Marshall said, if you ever have a chance, look in Kitty's eyes. So I said, okay. So I didn't know what to say at lunch, so I figured I'd look in her eyes. And it was very startling because she was, however that is, she was looking inward. She wasn't looking at me. And she turned around and she said, I think I'll ask you to play a tape tonight on the center, and because I think you can do that. And that's what actually started the whole tape recording of Baba's stuff. You know? And I continued having correspondence with Kitty when I was in New York. And of course, she always called me the wrong name, was Dear Christy. And when I came back to visit maybe the next year, I was over the summer, it was in August, and I was trying to decide whether I should leave my job at a printing company where I was working at. I'll tell you how I got there. This is related to the foundation, at least in my mind, because it's about printing and getting into it. And so I was trying to decide if I should continue. Oh no, I was still teaching. So I was trying to decide whether I should, in September, continue teaching or I should try to become a printer. And she got all excited. She said, oh, her father was a printer. She used to help out and set type where he was. They set the English equivalent of the Sotheby's catalogs. She said, Baba would need a printer, and it was a great thing. And I got so excited. I said, okay, I'll be a printer, you know. And I didn't know how to become a printer. And I remember talking to Louis Agostini, who was a Baba lover, he lived in Brooklyn. And he met Baba, had a long history with Baba, and he was also a typographer in Manhattan. So he tried to give me tips, you know, and I finally, and I went to the head of the Typographers Union. Printing was a blue-collar profession at that time. There were no computers or anything. It was like guys running presses and setting hot type, and it was a grungy industry. And so I went up to the head of the Typographers Union, and he was this man sitting behind a desk. It was very dusty. He was on 14th Street in Manhattan, and he was smoking a cigar. So I said, I want to become a printer. And he said, oh, girl can't become a printer in New York. And what I did is I didn't have a portfolio to show him, so I made up a portfolio of my from my figure drawing classes at Pratt, where I went to school. And it was just totally inappropriate. And so he said, forget it. And so I went to an employment agency, the Beaver Employment Agency. And I said, I want to be a printer. You know how I can do that? And they said, well, the closest we can get you is running like a switchboard in a printing plant. And so I went for a job interview at this place. The printing industry was down in Lower Manhattan. And the way a lot of it worked, there'd be one company that was a printer. And on the next floor of the same building, there'd be another company that just were typesetters or plate makers. They were independent companies, but they all worked with each other. So our company did printing. So it had printing presses. And it also had to do what's called stripping, which is assemble film and then make plates in a small kind of way. And anyway, so I went there, and my job was to run a kind of a switchboard, and I had no office skills whatsoever. So I wasn't very good at it. I remember one part of my job was filing, and there was a room in the back called the dead files. And when I go back there, and everybody would yell at me, it's like, "What's the matter? You don't know the alphabet? You can't even file?" So I go into the dead files, and I'd really be crying. I said, "No, I'm going to do it, you know." And finally, I think what happened is they said, "Oh, here's what it was. I was going to quit my job. I was never going to get to be a printer this way because I was just in the front office, you know, low man." And so I went on a Monday night to one of Fred and Ella's meetings, and Bernice Ivory was there. And I sat down next to her and I said, "I'm going to quit my job tomorrow. It's just not working out." And she said, "Do you think Baba really wants you to do that?" And I figured, Jesus, I really stuck this out. So I went in the next morning with the idea that I was going to quit. And I said, "I'll wait till lunchtime." And what do you call it? The Bowery was right near Canal Street and where I was working. And so I went for a walk on the Bowery. And I had my first conversation with Baba. And I just said to him, "Hey, this is your problem. This is not my problem. You figure it out." And the whole thing just went off my shoulders. And when I got back to work, the head of the company came up to me and he said, "From now on, your job is going to be to watch somebody run a multi-lith, a little printing press. And we're going to send you to school at night on an overview of all of printing productions, mostly meant for salesmen, and how to run a multi-lith." Completely inappropriate for my performance. The only thing I could figure out is they paid an agency fee for me, and they weren't getting their money's worth when I was in the front office. So I think they were giving it a shot. And I was absolutely over the moon. And my job was just to load paper into a multi-lith, and there was a pressman and he would run it. Normally, one pressman can run two multi-liths. You can do that. But they had one multi-lith with two press people on it. And eventually, you know, as I went to school at night, I learned how to run it. And then if they'd ever get slow, I saw there was this plate maker there. And so I said, "Do you think I can learn that?" And nobody volunteered to learn things. So I was really considered like a goofball, you know. But I went and I learned how to make plates, and I was a plate maker, so that if they got slow in printing, I could go over there and make plates. And then I also asked if I could do stripping, which is assemble the film. I must have stripped 1,000 from the desk of Mr. So-and-so little notepads. But that's how I learned how to strip, you know. And I was there for quite a while. And at one point, they came up to me and said, "We're throwing out all this paper. Do you want it?" And George, Adele's husband at the time, had a truck. So he loaded his truck up. And it's typical in printing companies, you know, when you cut out from the big sheets, it's scrap left over. And this was scrap, but it was beautiful paper. And so we loaded it up in his truck and kept it. And then I got a letter from Kitty. She said, "Do you think you can print up a book list for the center?" And very simple. One side of it's books by Baba, books about Baba. You know, just 4x9, just a little card like that. And Adele had a typewriter that typed in italics. So I typed it all up because then I would photograph it. It was offset printing. And I sent copies to Elizabeth and Kitty. Oh, and she said, "This is very important." Elizabeth spent 2 hours on it. So I sent her a proof. And I sent it, which they didn't know I had to send it to Fred and Ella, John Bass, and Harry Kenmore. And I said, asked Fred and Ella, and they said, "If that's what Elizabeth wants, it's fine." John Bass said the same thing. But I couldn't get through to Harry. I'd call after work got off at 4:30 every day, and I'd go across to the phone booth, and I'd call up Harry, and I'd get Anna Rosa, and she would yell, and she'd scream at me. And people, the older Baba lovers in New York, started getting wind of this. And they would tell me, this is not Baba's way. You don't get Kitty and Elizabeth, I'm sorry, you don't get Fred and Ella, John Bass, and who was the other one? Fred and Ella, John Bass, and Harry Kenmore to approve stuff of Elizabeth Patterson's. That's not Baba's way. That's what he said. I didn't know. And I'd have people come and visit me in my apartment trying to convince me not to do what I was doing. And it was a very hot time. And I finally got, one time after a Baba meeting, so it was like 9:30 at night, I went into a phone booth in Manhattan. I figured, I'll try a different time. And Harry Kenmore had an answering machine. I had never heard an answering machine. This was 66 or 67. And so I heard and he was hard of hearing. So it said, "This is Harry Kenmore." And I jumped right out of the phone booth. Yeah. And finally, one day I got him. I don't know how. And he said, because I'd sent them a proof. And he said, "This is terrible. This is slum printing. The paper is slum paper." And I said, "You mean you need to see it exactly the way it's going to print?" And he said, "Yes." Of course, he can't see it all. And so I felt I had my permission to print, but not to distribute. And meanwhile, the company I was working for said I can come in the evenings or the weekend and use their equipment to print, which is completely against their policy. And so I went in on a Saturday to print the book lists, and I used all that paper that we had been storing in George's truck. And at that time, you couldn't print one, so I printed up 10,000 book lists, but I wouldn't distribute them. And I brought them up to my apartment and sent them out to everybody again. I remember Adele would come knocking on my door. She lived in the same building. And she'd say, "I just got a letter from somebody who asks for a book list. Do you have a book list?" And I said, "Sorry, Adele, you can't have any." And I had like 10,000 of them. And so when I sent it around to all those people again, Fred Nell and John Bass said, "If Elizabeth likes it, that's fine." But Harry got infuriated, and I don't know why, but except that was his nature. And he starts yelling and screaming at me. And I know I must have misunderstood him, but I honestly thought he was threatening my life. And I got really scared. So I called up Fred Ella and crying. And I said, "Harry Kenmore's going to kill me. What should I do?" And they said, "Although Bob is in seclusion, you can write him to clarify instructions." So I wrote Bob this unbelievably naive letter telling him what everybody was saying, and that if he didn't want me to be a printer, that was fine. Let me know one way or the other. I could be something else. And I said, "I try to be understanding to Harry. After all, he can't see or hear, but I think he's behaving very badly." And the letter was sent and got a cable back almost right away after they got it, saying, "In the future, work with either Kitty and Elizabeth, Fred and Ella, I think, I don't know if John Bass was part of that. He may have passed on by then, or Rick and Alan. And only with Harry Kenmore if it had something to do with him." And then it was read to Bob that I was going to printing school at night, because I was. And here, when she wrote Baba's reaction, she said, "Baba was amused to hear I was going to printing school." And I always imagined him going, I don't know why. And then I had actually asked Baba around that time. Yeah, I think I told you if I could make the tapes. And that's when I started making tapes for him. And then when I was also working at that printing company, somehow or another I connected with another printer in Manhattan, this older man, and he had this really small shop, but he had a big light table, and he let me come in the evenings and work on it. So that's where I put together the what do you call it? Those pamphlets of the discourses, and I may even have printed them there. I don't remember, but I remember he had a collating machine, so he collated and stitched them. Going ahead, Bob would come out of seclusion. I went down to the to the center during that week. And I stayed with Nisi. Nisi and I had become very good friends. I used to have dinner with her every Monday night in Manhattan instead of going all the way home before Baba meeting, one of Fred and Ella's meetings. And during that time, Kitty asked me to write Warren Healy, who was a Baba lover. I think he was from Seattle, and he had a letterpress, which was it wasn't offset printing, and he printed a lot of Baba's material. He printed the Awakener magazine. He printed the New Humanity, and the most beautiful. His pamphlets were gorgeous. They had gold and blue and were designed, and they were jewels. They were out of love. So Kitty asked me to write to him to say, would he mind if I did printing too? I did. And he wrote back, I wish I knew where that letter was, but he wrote back saying, printing is the most wonderful meditation in Baba, and you should go ahead and do it, And also, while I was down here, I had dinner with Kitty and Nisi, and we're all sitting around a table, and it was going great. And then out of the blue, Kitty said that somebody named Gary in New York was going to come and move to Myrtle Beach. Well, Gary and I had worked together a lot in New York. He put out the Monday night Meher Baba Lovers newsletter, and I would print it somehow, and maybe on the ditto machine. I don't know. And but if I ever saw a mistake, he wouldn't even let me correct it. It had to do it exactly what he said. It was like I was his slave. And so when I was having dinner with Kitty, and just to back up, what happened is Bruce Hoffman lived in New York also at the time, actually fairly near me, near the George Washington Bridge. And in the evenings, I'd come home and I'd call up Bruce and I'd say, you'll never guess what Gary said to me today. So that's the kind of relationship we had. And so when we were having dinner with Kitty and Nisi, Kitty said, Gary Brilliant is down here. And I got so angry. I said, and so am I. And that is the only reason I moved down here. And she actually got it wrong. What she meant to say was, Bruce Hoffman's going to be visiting this summer. So, not coming from any kind of desire to move down here. I was just doing it. And so I went for a job interview at the Sun News was the local newspaper, came out twice a week. In the back of the Sun News was a little commercial print shop. They had a multi-lith and a bigger press. And the mayor of Myrtle Beach was the owner of the newspaper and the printing company. And his name was Mark Garner. And I remember him interviewing me. And during that week, the Columbia University students had taken over Columbia University in Manhattan, or wherever, upper Manhattan. And so it was in the news, them hanging out the windows and taking over. So Mr. Garner was interviewing me, and he said, are you a beatnik? And I said, oh, no, absolutely not. And he said, do you drink? I said, no. He said, fine, you're hired. And so I went back. Well, when I went back to Nisi's, I met with Elizabeth to tell her. And I said to Elizabeth, I have use of a press in New York now, so I'm not sure I should come down here because I can print up Baba's stuff there. And she said, Baba's coming out of seclusion, and we don't know what that means. So go ahead and write him and see. So again, I wrote to Baba and just saying exactly what was happening. I don't know if I should move here or not, and got back a letter. I don't know who it was from, Go Here or Erich. It's one of them. They would do his correspondence saying, oh no, it was from Adi. And then saying, Baba is now in exclusion, so he's not receiving correspondence. But if you make your decision with Baba in mind, and if it's to your benefit financially, Baba's behind it. Well, I couldn't compute that, and I figured that's probably fine. So I quit my job, and I went down there. And I bought an old car for $85, a Chevy Bel Air, and drove down. And, you can hear it. It was like dunk, dunk. It was, the rods were not right in it, whatever that means. And I drove it into Nisi's yard where she parked the car, got to Happy House, and was there. And Nisi was fantastic. She was such a loving person. And I'd come back from the Sun News every afternoon, and we'd have champagne on her back veranda, because she had just found out that she had privileges at the air base because her husband had been killed in World War II. So she'd get a case of champagne and we would drink, and just a little toast. And she was so loving. Kitty and Elizabeth and Margaret all loved her. And yeah, she was all love, you know. And so I was living with her. And then at one point, really at the beginning, the man who ran the print shop in Myrtle at the Sun News left. That left me as the most experienced person, and I didn't know anything because my job, they hired me to run the multilith. So I had to learn what's called stripping, which is assembling. I knew some of it, but not the complicated kind that they did, and making plates. And I had to learn how to use their big camera. You have to shoot everything, make film, and I knew nothing. And I'd come home a wreck every night because I was having to make up printing and then do what worked. There was nobody else to ask. And it was so difficult. And I'd come home and just exhausted from it. And Nisi would say, well, that was eight hours you didn't think about yourself, wasn't it? And I said, oh my God, what sympathy I'm getting, you know? And I remember they decided at some point, I began to really love working there. I loved the people. And there were a group of girls sitting around a desk at lunchtime. We'd all have our lunch together. And one of them was from Conway. She was a typesetter. Two of them were from Conway. And they talked with this real twang, and I couldn't understand them. So I used to sit around the table, and I had no idea what they were saying, or if they were asking me something I had to respond to. But it was fun, and eventually it got connected. And Kitty had told me, or Elizabeth had told me, don't mention Baba. And the second week that I was running the press, I caught my finger in the rollers. So I had to, and I shouted out Baba's name, and had to go to a doctor to see if my thumb was broken. And he x-rayed it, and I was fine. The next week, I got the same thumb caught in the rollers again. I went to the same doctor, and he said, have you thought of changing your profession? And again, I shout out Baba's name. So at some point they were putting it together, you know, and they had very weird ideas of what Baba was, that they didn't know what reincarnation was. And they said they had heard that Kitty used to be Elizabeth's dog. You know, they just had no idea what, the center up in North Myrtle Beach was a big mystery to them, you know. And so what happened was that they decided to use their big newspaper press, which was only running twice a week for the, you know, 2 editions a week, to use it for other things. So they decided and one of the editions was a special farm edition with pictures of tractors. It was for Conway. And there was color in it, a little bit of color, like 2 colors. Not only did I have to learn how to strip it, but because it was a web press, which means one sheet sort of threads through the press and eventually gets folded and a complete newspaper comes out. So you had to strip it in a way that the pages were in sequence. The pagination was correct. I had no idea. I had to go home the instruction manuals, which would talk about pagination, and I would pray that everything came out right, and it did. But I was like, my heart was in my mouth. Is page 1 going to be where it's supposed to be? And it was. And then I remember I was so excited with the farm equipment edition. I remember after work, I ran over to Kitty's, and Elizabeth was in the living room in that chair by the front door, and Delia was visiting, and I wanted to show them the farm edition. So I said, Elizabeth, I'd like to show you this. And she stopped everything, and she looked at it. She looked at every page. Oh, imagine. When I was living with Nisi for, I don't know, probably just 6 or 7 months. I moved there in June of 68. And probably that summer or that fall, I decided, it came up to get our own press, little multilith. And Jim Meyer was in something called Vista, which was like the Peace Corps, but it was domestic. And he was in Tennessee. And he was working with a minister who had a little printing press. And it was for sale for like $300 or something, which was way beyond, I had no money at all. And Elizabeth helped me write a letter to all the Baba groups trying to raise money. And so I just wrote down whatever she said, and I sent it out. And things would come in the mail every day in Nisi's mailbox. Here is $100. What we would like in a year is 100 Baba cards. Or here's an interest-free loan, or something like that. And I'm getting this a little bit mixed up, but it's basically that. And so I went ahead and purchased the press, and we put it. It was a room in Happy House. I believe it's where when Wendy was living there with her mother, she used it for her dollhouse. It was very small, and it was empty now. So we put the press in there, and I made a homemade plate maker, which was a box with a hinge and a lid that hooked, that came down and had a little window in it, and there was a thick piece of foam in there. So I put a plate and stripped up negatives on there, closed the window so it was like very, very tight, and took a sun lamp and exposed it for like 10 minutes. And during those 10 minutes, I would sit and watch television with Nisi. We'd sit and watch Perry Como or something. And then I'd go back and develop the plates. And I started printing God in the Pill because there was a great need for that. But I needed to collate and stitch them, which is put the staples in them. And before that, I wanted to print up this pamphlet, What Baba Means by Real Work. And I only had a really crummy copy, so I just couldn't photograph it and print it. So I asked this man who ran their linotype machine, Stalvey, his last name was Stalvey, if I would pay him to set the type. And I thought I was being like really a big deal. I gave him $10. And he'd come in like an hour early every morning till he said it. And then we looked, and it was printed by Carolina Printers, who were a printer in Myrtle Beach years before. And Elizabeth had it printed, and he was the typesetter then. Anyway, so we printed that, and then printed up God in the Pill. The little room was so hot, and flies would get into the rollers, and it was a very, very, very old press. And but it worked. Well, after I asked Mr. Stalvey to typeset What Baba Means by Real Work, it got back to Mr. Garner, who was the owner of the newspaper and the mayor. He called me in his office, and he said, I hear you have a press at home. I said, yeah, it's Mayor Baba. He said, well, you can't work here and have a competitive press. I said, no. We're just printing up Baba stuff. So then he said, I met Baba. When he was here, there was a day, like a public day, and I couldn't make it. And Elizabeth asked me if I wanted a private meeting with Baba, and I said, yeah. So I met him, and he said, well, that's okay. And then what they started doing, they started ordering paper for me. They ordered plates because I didn't have any accounts with the graphic arts company, so I'd buy and pay them for it. And I would bring the printed sheets of God in the Pill in after work. I'd use their folder, and the girls that I was working with, they'd stay late and they'd collate it. They had no idea what they were doing, but it was fun. And then we'd stitch them, and the bus station was across the street, so we'd wrap them up and we'd ship them out. It was lovely. It was lovely. The plans were made about Darshan, Baba, what had happened was like I was at the Sun News, I was working on a Saturday, and the news about Baba's dropping his body came early Saturday morning. And Nisi got a call from her daughter, who was a Sufi, in the middle of the night telling us, because they heard somehow out there. I think probably Adi wrote to somebody there or cabled. So we knew about it. And we went out in the middle of the night and just felt like, oh, Baba's, okay now, everything is, neither of us had met him. So it felt like he was freed, and, and then Kitty somehow, oh yeah. And Kitty, there was a meeting where everybody was called on the center and they were told by Kitty and Elizabeth. And then at one point, very shortly after that, the Mandali wrote to Kitty about Darshan. What should we do? Because people were planning to go to Darshan, on 3 different trips. There was a Sufi group came first. They were in April. The Myrtle Beach group was end of May, beginning of June. And then the Society or New York group was after that in June. And I was going to go with the Myrtle Beach group. But nobody knew now, since Baba dropped the body, what was going to happen. And Kitty called up everybody and said, come over. And she called me. She said, come over after work. I only want to work a half a day. Buy some cookies. So I knew it was good news, about the Darshan. And that's when she announced that it's still going to happen. And so just to move up, I went with the Myrtle Beach group to Darshan. I had no idea what it was, who anybody was. I knew Kitty, I knew Elizabeth, and a few people, Fred and Ella, and a few other people. And I had a very difficult time being in India. It was not the Baba that I was familiar with, that I knew, which was in printing. And I didn't get it. There was a chair in Guru Prasad and it had Baba's sandals. And I realized like Baba had a sister and he had a Sadra, he had a life outside of me. And I didn't like that, So I just couldn't relate at all. I was audio taping the whole time. And while everybody was having genuine experiences, everybody go up to the chair. I wasn't. I was just, this is passing me by. And I came back sort of very disenchanted. And I used to play tapes every Saturday every Sunday probably on the center. And when I came back, I started doing it, but everything was wrong. Like the tape would be stretched and it would say, like that, or nobody would show up. And then I just stopped showing up. I didn't even want to come to the center. I was really upset. And it was that, and the rumor was around that I was leaving Baba, and I didn't think I was leaving Baba at all. I was just mad about Darshan and I wanted my own version of Baba. And it came June 21st. It was probably 3 or 4 weeks after we got back. And the whole thing lifted. So I called up Kitty and I said, do you think I could play tapes again on the center? And she said, yeah, I was just waiting for you to ask. It's very sweet. And she's the only one that stayed friends with me. During that period, she asked me to go out to lunch with her or dinner. And at the end of the dinner, she said, my own brother left Baba, and it's perfectly all right if you do that. And she took the whole sting out of it. I mean, she's masterful, Anyway, so I kept printing at the Sun News and would do Baba printing at night. And then it's 1970. Things were it was after Darshan. I do remember one thing that happened after Darshan. My mind was so scrambled. The first job I had to work on when I went back to work was the Miss Myrtle Beach high school pageant, beauty pageant, and I had to shoot halftones of the contestants. Some were white, some were black. There's a whole variety of things. And I had totally forgotten how to shoot, like what exposures to pick. So I would say Bob's name and pick numbers. And those poor girls, you couldn't even tell anything. But the wonderful thing about working in a print shop in Myrtle Beach, there is not a big workforce out there that can replace you. So they stuck it out, you know. Okay, so and you know, over the years, there was always talk about starting a press. And in fact, that's what it was. Nisi was going to California to visit her daughter, and she was afraid to fly by herself. So I was going to fly with her. And while I was there, I was going to talk to Rick Chapman and Ivy Deuce about raising funds to start a printing press. That was on my mind. So I met with Rick, and he basically said, you know, good luck. We don't have any, you know, we can't really help, and clearly. And then I was scared to go to see Ivy Deuce. But it worked out that Nisi dropped me off at her house without me knowing that she was going to leave. So I was there. And Ivy played me a tape, audio tape, Memphis Sufis, which was about never change Baba's words when you're publishing. And she spoke this and that. And then I talked to her about plans to start a press. And she said, my only, you know, recommendation is, you know, keep it practical. Keep, you know, charge what you should charge or something like that. I don't exactly remember. It was very friendly, but they weren't going to participate. And while I was there, I was wined and dined. I was introduced at the Sufi Center, and they said things about me that weren't true, but they were better than what I was, and I just took it. So by the time I got back to Myrtle Beach, my head was way too big. I came back without Nisi, and the first thing that happened was that the person who was supposed to meet my plane forgot. So nobody met me. And then Nisi eventually came back, and I would drive her over to Kitty and Elizabeth, and they'd leave me out in the car, and she would visit with them and have a good time. And I was like, nothing was working, you know. And people were asking me, when is a press going to start? And I'd say, oh God, if you want a press, go make one, you know. And then I got a call one night at Nisi's from Kitty. She said, come over to Gateway to Pine Lodge. Pine Lodge was before Gateway. Where at first, people, when they came to the center, would come to Kitty and Elizabeth's home in Deruba. And then they came to Pine Lodge, which was sort of a greeting area, like Gateway is now. And so Kitty was on duty at Pine Lodge. And she said, come over to Pine Lodge. It's time to think of a floor plan for the press. So, okay. And so I came over, and she said, what we have to do is to describe to Elizabeth and see where we can build a building. So Elizabeth walks in, and Kitty says, we're just talking about building a building for a press, and where should we build it? And Elizabeth said, well, you can't build it on the center, but why don't you just look for land? And Tom Rogers worked on the center. He was Lee Minchie's brother. He was like a hillbilly. He was a delightful person. He was a carpenter, and he worked on the center doing carpentry. And he walked in, and she said, Tom, we're just talking about building a building for the press. And he said, in Baba's love, I'd love to build it. You know? So we're all set. And Tom went home to where he lived in North Myrtle Beach, and was in a gas station, and he said, does anybody know of any land? And Mr. Long, who was I think was his landlord, said, yeah, I'm building a beauty parlor for my daughter, and I'll build you a building adjacent to it and lease it to you, and that'll help me with my expenses. So Tom got all excited. He called me up, told me, and I was like over the moon. And I went and told Kitty, and she said, how can you do such a thing? You have no money. You know, it was her idea in the first place. And it was practically the next day. I went into the way Andy and I remember this differently. I went into the center through the Arts Gate, which is called Sherier Gate, and Andy was coming out. Andy was a worker on the center one of his jobs was to walk Beauty, the dog, Elizabeth's dog, and to, be a center worker, clean out, do cleaning and stuff. And he had a big beard, and he was kind of unapproachable and very, very quiet. And so he met me at the Sherier gate and said, if you ever want to start a press, I want to back it. And I said, don't say anything, but come to my house tonight and I'll tell you all about it. And I used to, after I'd finished playing the tapes, I would return them to Dilruba, to Kitty. And so I wanted to tell her that Andy's coming over tonight to talk about the press. And she had a whole office full of people. And I said, Andy Lesnick is coming to my house tonight. And she said, that's nice, And he came over and I took out the correspondence from Baba, told him all the stories. And he was very excited. And there was a guest house next to Happy House, which is also on the center now, but it was in town. And Andy went over and he called his father, who he was very close with. And it was something, the way I remember it is probably not Andy's words, but guess what, Dad? I'm going in the printing business. And I think his father was delighted because he knew Andy's had such great strengths and talent to be in the world, that he could use in the world. And he was, I think, a little bit concerned that he was just walking a dog and cleaning cabins. I think. I mean, I don't know where I got that impression. So his father was thrilled. So we decided his father was going to be in Hampton, Virginia the next week. And we decided we would drive up there and go see Henry Cashowdy, who's a judge. And the next day we would meet Andy's father with the judge, talk about the press. And we said, that's a real good plan. So we get up there, and all Henry wanted to do was to play begin the beguine on this trombone. We never talked about the press, and it never worked out for some reason with him talking to his father, but his father was all for it. He said, that's great, So we got back, and the idea was Andy would keep his job on the center and just be a silent partner. And then there was a print show in Chicago, in Charlotte, came there every 2 years, and to show new equipment and new everything. And if you buy things there, it's much reduced. So we went up there. There was somebody named Elizabeth Cheney. I think she was, or maybe still was, a Sufi. She was a very high-strung person. And she'd be scared. He's like, whoa. And there was somebody named Ron Dillman, who was very close with us. So the four of us went up to the show in Charlotte. And by this time, we had raised some money, and Andy had his money. But it wasn't enough, really, to, the rule of thumb was you should have something like 5 years of expenses in the bank before you start. We didn't, for sure. And so, but what happened is we'd go around, and I knew a lot of the salespeople there because I would buy the graphic art supplies for the Sun News when I was working there. And one of them said, I think you should buy this camera. So Andy, who always is composed, said, we'll have to discuss that. And so we stepped away, and he turned to me and said, should we get it? And I said, I don't know, I think so. He said, okay. So we walked over to the guy and said, fine, we'll buy it. And then we bought all this equipment, And we also bought a multi-lith from a multi-lith salesman at another time. And it was very exciting. Andy was living at Laura Delevingne's house, who was an old Baba lover who I think she knew Inayat Khan. She was a Sufi until she moved here and just was on her own. And she was a lovely, lovely person. And she put up the boys. The boys would stay in her house in, different rooms. And Nisi put up the girls. So other people were staying in her house. And I would go over to Laura's at night, and Andy and I would spread out all these brochures about presses and what we should get. And and poor, sweet Laura, she'd sit and just watch us, And finally, and they were building the building, And what had happened is April Fool's Day of that year, I was still at the Sun News, and Kitty came to me and she said, there's been a terrible accident up where they're building your building, and it's been destroyed. And I went, oh my God. And she said, April Fool, April Fool. So months later, we finally opened. It was third week in May. And the people that were there were Elizabeth Cheney. She was doing typewriting and typesetting, which was like this, it was called a variotyper. It was like a typesetter of sorts. And somebody named Michael Childs was running the press. He was an experienced pressman, myself and Andy. The four of us were there. And the place was so small. Andy's desk was a little kitchen table, and he had to put a long cord on the phone so he could stand out in the middle of Highway 17 and talk, because he could not hear inside the room. And because there was a press going, there was a folder, it was noisy. It was 600 square feet. At least 100 or 200 of it was darkroom, you know. So we opened our doors, and that first week, we're all inside, and we heard this enormous crash, and the walls were cracking, and there was some impact, and it stopped right at a picture of Baba under my light table, and a big truck was going by, and the flatbed trailer that was hooked onto it detached and hit my car, which was on the side of the building, destroyed my car, and it went into the building. But inside, we didn't know what had happened. And I remember feeling euphoric. There was something that happened. And the headline in the North Myrtle Beach Times that week was, Sherier Press stands firm. And anyways, we thought that we were going to just do Baba stuff, because Kitty kept saying there needs to be a Baba printer. It's going to be great. She was a real enthusiastic about the press. So the first week we printed God in a Pill. No, we printed the Prayer of Repentance, How to Love God, the Repentance Prayer, and I don't know, maybe one or two things. And all of a sudden we realized we had machine payments. We hadn't thought it through. People to pay. We had to make money. We couldn't just do Baba printing. So Andy realized he had to go out and sell. And he'll tell his story, but it was so beautiful to me, because at that time, that little press was kind of a conduit for people to get back into the world. You know, it was, it was the early 70s, late 60s, and people of our age had sort of, oh, the world is no good, and, but we were forced into it. And I remember Andy going out and begging for printing. And that's how he learned, how to sell, but it was very, very hard. And fortunately, we started when a lot of the major Myrtle Beach companies that are in Myrtle Beach now, they also started then. So we did a lot of their letterheads and envelopes and things like that, and had relationships that have lasted for years. And I remember one of our first customers was a minister, a Black minister, and his name was Reverend Bliss. And he asked us to do a poster of a revival. And I was just convinced it was Baba visiting us. And at one point, Andy realized he had to shave off his beard to sell. And I remember his father came to town, and we went to the Chesapeake House restaurant. And I was sitting there with his father waiting for Andy to come and join us. And this guy walks up to the table. I didn't recognize him. I'd never seen Andy's chin before he had shaved. And it was so awesome to me how he dived into the world of selling. It's what the press needed. It wasn't who he was. He wanted to be a poet the rest of his life, but he did it. And it was awesome to me. And he had said he realized the key to our success was there was only one other printer in town, and they'd been there for years, and they were called the good old boy printers. they knew everybody in town, they had everything locked up, but they were never on time with their printing. And he said, the key to our success is we'll keep our promises. And boy, did that make it. That was absolutely cut to the chase. And we started getting very busy, and it took us several years to learn how to, it took me several years to learn how to basically supervise people. I had no idea how to do it. And I remember customers would come. We didn't invite customers to come because we had no room for them, and we always sort of thought of ourselves as a big printer. So we just did good work, and we had the salesman talk to them. And Owen Cooper at that time was a salesman. I know some of you might know him. He lives out in California now. No, he lives in Washington. So I remember one customer came to the door, and we heard her knock. And we said, come on in. And she said, I'm trying. Couldn't even open the door. There were like boxes and cartons and paper all over the place, And I remember at one time I came in the morning and Beth Chaney was standing in a puddle of water. The whole place had flooded. We had just started printing the Mayor Baba journals, I believe, and they were sort of in separate, it's called signatures, sheets. And what had happened was when our building was being built, there were a series of faulty toilet bowls installed all up and down North Myrtle Beach, and ours exploded at night. And she was standing with her little shoes, holding them up, and her little anklets, and her little pinafore dress. Whoo! The journals were floating all around her, and but we got through it, And it was just the place was so small. The way Andy would put it is you couldn't have your own thoughts. Everybody was in your, we're all in your head. Around 1975, we outgrew our first building. There was just no way to contain it. It was so crowded. And Mr. Long, who was our landlord at this building, he was selling some land actually right around the corner that contained some like a row of apartments. They were sort of like summer rentals. And so he sold us the land and the apartment, and we bought it. And then we gave away the apartments. We didn't want them. So Hernandez, what's his first name? Ralph. Ralph Hernandez arranged for it to be moved where it was, and that became Kukin's. The people are still living in there, And we built that building. And it was like so difficult because you had to have more of an inside structure because you couldn't just turn around and ask somebody to do something like the old building. You had to have like a schedule and a meeting and stuff like that. And also, though, in that first building, we hired our first non-Baba lover. And I tell you, that was so wonderful because the reason he was in printing was because he loved printing. And the reason the Baba lovers were in printing was because it had something to do with Baba. And, many of them really didn't like printing, And, but for the first 5 years, that's all we hired was Baba lovers, So we hired either somebody named Bob Giraldo or Bob Billingsley. I don't remember who was first. And it was great. It was a real eye-opener. And, and different people worked there. Jane Brown worked. She was a typesetter. And just lots and lots of people. And we had our dedication of the building. And, Elizabeth was there, and Andy's father was there, and Jane. Kitty was up and visiting her relatives in Canada. And Dot was pregnant with Juniper. And Becca was this little girl, and Becca cut the ribbon, and Fred and Ella. Oh God, Fred was such a lifesaver to us. He's a very good mechanic. And in that building, we bought a first real press called a Heidelberg. And Jim Roble and I were trained on it. And at that opening of the building, the dedication to the building, Jim Roble was visiting from California. And we met with him and offered him a job. We completely outgrew this press, the old press. And at different times, Dot worked there, and she did some designing and did some stripping. And Branch, did Polly work? Yeah, Polly worked there. And I can't remember. Jeff Wolverton was a pressman. He eventually learned to run the press. And there were many people that would work, and it was kind of their pathway back into the world. I mean, they might not describe it that way, but it was that way for some people. And I remember one of the first things we printed was Phyllis Fredericks gave us an Awakener, a new issue of the Awakener to print. People were very generous to us. The Sufis gave us a book to print, little, like a children's book. And Ivy Deuce, when she visited Myrtle Beach, came to the small building. And we were printing a poster for Belks, and it had a dollar sign on it. And she picked it up and took it, and I always was really struck by that. And so anyway, it went on, and eventually we realized we had to move, but before that, the first book we published was The God Man. And we did that, I think at Kitty and Elizabeth and Delia's encouragement. And it had to be printed, at another printer. We just supervised it. And I remember Andy had to fly up to New York where it was being printed because they were making corrections and they never got it right. So he went up and looked at it. And that came out. It was our first book. And and our very first book, actually, or maybe right after that, was Sparks of the Truth for Phyllis Fredericks. And it's by Deschmuck, and it was Baba, actually by Baba through Deschmuck. And I remember, and Phyllis Frederick had edited it, and we somehow showed it to Elizabeth because Baba had said that we have to get all of our printing approved by Kitty Elizabeth, Rick and Chapman, or Rick and Rick Chapman, and Alan Cohen, or Fred Neller and John Bass. And so when we had to print, I'd bring the cover over and Elizabeth would either criticize it or not, and we'd move with it. And what'd we do? And then after we printed it, Elizabeth said, "So how are you going to sell these?" I don't know. We'll put them in cartons, and if people want them. We had a little bookstore in that first little building. It was a shelf. Oh, so many things had happened. But at any rate, in around 1985, so 10 years we were in that building, we outgrew that building. And by that time, Andy had started an advertising agency as part of the press. It was called Sherier Advertising. And it was kind of a way for the press to get printing because we would design things and get them printed. They would design things. And then it grew into a separate company, which was Lesnick, Himmelsbeck, Wilson, and Hurl. And so we moved into the new building. The agency was on one half of the front and the press was on the other. And then the press had the whole back, which was the press room and bindery. And that new building was such a challenge to get internal structures so that people could work and know what they were doing. We made a little bit of progress of that moving into the second building, but this third building really, really needed some structure. And it was very, very challenging. But we had the, luck of doing a Baba book every once in a while, and that was so great to be able to do that. We went from 600 square feet to 4,000 square feet to 22,000 square feet, portion of which the agency was in. I can't tell you a lot of information about being in that building. We got a 40-inch two-color press, and we got I think 4 or 5 color Komori, smaller press. And I remember Andy and our pressman and somebody else went to Canada to look at a used Komori. And they bought it the day that Infinite Intelligence started printing on our press here. And, I'm sorry. All the while, though, periodically we would put out a Baba book. And the way it was handled was that the Baba books always lost money. We knew that, but we wanted to do it, and that was just the way it was, And we would sell them. Did we have a bookstore? Oh, in that building that we were in, there was a building there was a bookstore in the back where Ann Conlon ran, and people would come, and Kitty would eventually sometimes come. It was our, I don't know, 25th anniversary or something like that. The presses, and Janice, Andy's assistant, her name was Janice, wonderful girl. Knew about Kitty, and she told Kitty that they're going to have like a special little celebration at lunchtime, and Kitty came to the press's 25th anniversary, and she had written a poem about meeting deadlines or something. I wish I had the poem. It was really wonderful. Okay, I went to India sometime in the 80s, and Pat and Irene and I were shooting video, a lot of video. Go Hair took us around Merazad and talked about every one of the buildings. And Erich did the same thing. And we just got a ton of videos. And at the end of my stay, Mani said, "So who owns these videos?" So of course my first thought was, well, she obviously doesn't trust me. So Pat and Irene got together, and we're going to have a big meeting about it. And Pat and Irene and I got together, and when they were here the previous year or so, we had talked about something called Sherier Foundation. We didn't even know really what it was, but we were beginning to talk about it. So I think what had happened was that, I'm not sure what year it was, but the press went through a very difficult year financially, very difficult. And all of our Baba inventory was part of the press. And if the press went under, that would go with it, And we felt we also couldn't afford to subsidize the Baba books anymore because our own business was in such a precarious state. And there were people depending on us for their livelihoods, and we had nothing left to publish Baba books with. So when I was in India, I guess we started talking about a foundation, Sherier Foundation. And when I was in India and Mani said, "Who owns these videos?" Pat and I, and Irene said, "Well, let's tell them Sherier Foundation." So we went in, it was going to be this really big meeting. And we were meeting in the PRO, the reservation office in the trust compound there. And Mani said, "So who owns these videos?" And I said, Sherier Foundation. She got it immediately. She said, "That's great, because you're not working for any one group. Everybody will be able to get materials. You'll be able to make available everything to all groups. You won't be one group a group apart. And that is very much our culture, which is not to be exclusive, but to be inclusive of all the groups and not to encourage any disharmony between groups, and us, That's became a, I mean, that sort of, she picked up on it immediately, but that is one of the cornerstones of the foundation is not to be so self-involved, but as a resource for everyone.
Hello. Thank you so much for joining us. I hope that the video played correctly for everyone. Does anyone have any questions or anything to say?
There's Betty. Betty wants to say something.
Hi.
Hi, this was fabulous, boy. And I'm wondering now, is this going to be available on Baba Zoom, the recording, or is it available some other way?
Yes, it'll be available on the Baba Zoom YouTube, and we'll also be uploading it to our own YouTube as well. So it should
Awesome.
be up pretty soon.
Wonderful. Boy, was that great. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Sheila is absolutely incredible. I could watch that video back to back all day. She's a fantastic speaker.
Absolutely. I see Sheila's here. I don't know if she wants to say something about it.
Yes, hi Sheila.
Hi, can you hear me?
Absolutely.
Yes.
No, thank you for playing it. It's just my story. It's not the story of really what the press became and all those years, when it developed. That'll come sometime.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
thank you so much. We are absolutely so grateful to you for letting us play this today.
Yeah, that's great. Ann Barker asked me, so what can I do?
You can't say no to Anne. She's too
Yeah.
sweet.
Yeah. Okay, well, thank you.
Of course. Elizabeth, hi.
Hi. Oh, Sheila, I just wanted to thank you so much. Boy, that answered a ton of questions for me that I didn't even know I had about people. I'm not kidding you, about people, relationships. So I've been a friend of Alan Cohen's before I knew he was a Baba lover. And somebody had to tell me that he had written a book about Baba. I mean, it's ridiculous. But there were all these connections of people that I never knew were connected. And I always wondered who Andy Lesnick was. And I love the fact that one of the very first things you printed was Baba's discourse on real work. And as it turns out, your underlying principle is exactly what's in that discourse. The need to do my work, you have to be in harmony with others. That's the most important thing. And it's just really, and I loved all the problems that you had and how they got worked out. And how you kept the faith and anyway, it was really marvelous. So thank you so much. I really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
Thank you. Alrighty. Well, I am going to be putting my email in the chat. You can email me at archives@mayherarchive.org. I know putting people on the spot, you might not come up with questions right now, but if anything else comes to your mind, let me know. And if that's all that everyone has to say or any questions that everyone has, then I guess we will call the program to a close. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us today. This was such a treat, and I really hope everyone enjoyed it. So have a wonderful rest of your day, and Jai Baba.
Jai Baba. Thank you so much, Sheila. That was fabulous. Thank you, Claire, for bringing us together with this wonderful story.
Thank you. I had so much fun.
Okay. Jai Baba.
Jai Baba.
Wow, fabulous. Thank you so much, Sheila.